Hello! Today I'm returning to the Tekken series with a broad consideration of the story, the longevity, and the question of whether there is a need to revitalise the game series after almost 30 years. Now, as a huge fan of enduring game franchises such as Final Fantasy, Metal Gear Solid, Crash Bandicoot, and so on, that have each, to some degree or another, been remastered and remade over the years, such is the amount of time they've been around, I look at Tekken, which has been my favourite fighting game since it was first released back in 1994, and I wonder whether the same thing might be necessary, or indeed even more necessary for this particular series, given the length of time that's passed since its first release, and the fact that it is a chronological and continuous story. Because while Final Fantasy is an anthology of largely self-contained titles, and Metal Gear, God of War, and other game series tend towards a soft reboot when a number of years has passed and a number of games have passed, with 1998's Metal Gear Solid on the PS1 being one example, and 2018's God of War on the PS4 being another example of this sort of rejuvenation and soft reboot. Tekken, on the other hand, has been a continuous story since the very first game, and while it does indeed change things up a bit as time wears on, with the multi-generational lead role passing from Kazuya to Heihachi to Jin before merging today into something more of an ensemble vendetta, the core story of the Mishima feud, Kazuya's drive towards revenge against his father, and the cursed Devil bloodline theme have been a single continuous story, as I say, since 1994, which even for me, as someone that was alive in the mid-90s, albeit a very young child, I do find it a strange thing to sort of recall and keep up with and revisit on modern technology, looking to the games specifically. And I do wonder about these next generation and current generation players that were born in the 2000s, the 2010s even, who may be interested in Tekken today and this backstory, but are experiencing the games through the current generation and by other means, such as wikis, current game story modes, and so on, which, let's face it, do omit the stories and the character arcs of most of the characters on the roster outside of the core Mishima story, and they tend to push ahead with ever-convoluted new stories on this expanding roster in the current games, rather than taking stock of what's come before. So this has made me keen on the idea of at least the first trilogy of Tekken games, 1, 2 and 3, and whether we might reasonably argue that they warrant a remake to sort of recap on this essential origin story of Kazuya and Heihachi in the first tournament, as well as the other characters in the roster at that time. And crucially, looking to Tekken 3, of course, the debut of Jin Kazama in the monumental success that game was, which many players who were around for that release back in 1997-98 will attest to that being an all-time high point for the series, both in terms of gameplay, features and story. And I accept that the Namco team is conscious of this, and they have periodically tried to recapture the narrative origins of the games. And Tekken 5, for example, had an arcade history mode. Tekken 7 had its own story mode, which retold the core Mishima arc. And we have the occasional Tekken tag games, which bring together characters old and new, and while the tag games are not canonical, they do go a long way and make an effort to capture the essence of these character arcs and the interrelationships between these characters, whether that's Jun and Kazuya, whether that's Jun and Jin, Paul Phoenix and Law, or whoever that might be. So certainly there's been some effort, but nothing concerted in resurrecting the original games in the form of a remake or a remaster. And I suppose to argue against the need for that, we could look at the games for what they are, which is of course fighting games. And while I am a huge fan of the stories and the characters in Tekken, I do accept that some feel they are simply superfluous details that serve the purpose of holding the game together, bringing the world and the characters together for the core aspect of the games, which is the 1v1 fighting. And actually what's become increasingly apparent since at least Tekken 5 is the competitive gameplay aspect of Tekken, the esports aspect of Tekken, and the online competition and tournaments in Tekken. So there's a case to say that story is secondary and competitive gameplay is primary, and connected to that, I suppose, is of course the commercial aspects and the commercial potential of a Tekken game, and where they were once titles that were played on home consoles or in the arcade with friends, ostensibly offline, they are now behemoths of the joined-up esporting industry, and as such, do we really suppose that time and effort spent on a nostalgic, albeit updated, set of Tekken games is what Namco might want to lean towards? Though of course there may well be some competitive potential, within remade games. And on this note, I suppose I always found it quite telling that Harada, who is of course the voice and the face of the Tekken series, has his origins in sales and marketing, because while I've no doubt that he is emotionally invested in Tekken, and of course he is, my perception and indeed my first-hand experiences, working with sales and marketing teams, is that they tend to hear out any idea that they might think is good, and they do bring a lot of input into sort of conversations from a commercial perspective. They do ultimately only really get behind something when they are convinced of its potential to generate revenue and revenue returns, and not just generate profit, but to kind of maximize that profit to the nth degree. So looking to the broader arena of fighting games, what they are doing with Street Fighter 6 as a prime example, is that there has always been a relentless push towards the innovative, towards the updated, and towards the new, rather than looking back and revitalizing the old, taking stock of the old, and what the foundations of this series were and what they came from. So that's a brief case for and against, I suppose, a Tekken Remake trilogy, or at least a series of remakes. And while I personally would love to see some efforts being made to revisit this record-holding narrative expanse of Tekken's story so far, and particularly, as I say, with an update on the first trilogy of games, I do accept that the fighting game industry is a bit of a different beast to other nostalgia-inducing genres of games, such as platformers like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro, which have of course been remade, or RPGs like Final Fantasy. But if you've been playing Tekken for any length of time, I'd love to know your thoughts on this, so feel free to drop a comment below. And I'd love to see where you stand on the value of Tekken's story, whether you think it warrants revisiting, and whether you would be keen to see a reimagining of its earlier titles. Finally, if you got this far, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And please consider sharing, subscribing, and checking the description below to see how else you can support the channel.